The sky turned black, not from clouds, but from arrows. Thousands of longbow arrows rained down at once, crashing into the advancing French army. Horses screamed. Knights fell from their saddles. Men who had survived countless battles were cut down before they ever reached the English line. The charge that was supposed to win the battle was already falling apart. Yet the French refused to stop. They believed one more charge would break the English. One more attack would turn defeat into victory. Instead, every step forward only carried them deeper into Edward's trap. The muddy hillside slowed the horses. Heavy armor made every movement harder. Confusion spread through the ranks, as fallen men and wounded horses blocked the path ahead. Then another wave of arrows filled the sky. The English longbowmen fired with incredible speed, barely giving the French time to recover. Every volley struck with devastating accuracy. The French knights had spent their entire lives preparing for hand-to-hand combat, but they couldn't even reach the enemy. The English army barely moved. Their soldiers stayed behind wooden stakes in defensive positions, calmly releasing arrow after arrow while the French exhausted themselves trying to climb the hill. Every failed charge weakened the army even further. Still, the attacks continued. Pride refused to accept defeat. By now the battlefield had become a nightmare. Horses crashed into one another. Knights struggled to stand in the thick mud. Commanders could no longer control the chaos. What had begun as an organized assault had turned into complete confusion, and the English simply kept firing. By sunset, Europe's most feared knights had been shattered, not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked numbers, but because they had been outplanned. Edward III had forced the French to fight exactly the battle he wanted. The secret behind the victory wasn't a miracle, it wasn't luck. It was preparation, patience, and one brilliant battlefield tactic. The Battle of Crécy proved that the smartest strategy could defeat even the strongest army, and it changed the future of medieval warfare for the next 2 centuries. The answer began long before the first arrow was ever fired, long before the French army arrived. King Edward III had already made the most important decision of the battle. He didn't wait for the enemy to choose the battlefield. He chose it himself. A gentle hillside with soft, muddy ground and a clear view of the valley below. It looked ordinary, but it was the perfect trap. If the French wanted to win, they would have to attack uphill, exactly as Edward had planned. Across the valley, the French army finally appeared. It was larger, richer, and filled with some of the finest knights in Europe. Their cavalry had dominated battlefields for generations, and most commanders believed this battle would be no different. Confidence spread through the French ranks. Many thought victory was already theirs before the fighting had even begun, but without realizing it, they had already lost the first battle. Not to arrows, not to swords, but to positioning. Every step toward the English line worked against them. The muddy slope slowed their advance, broke their formations, and drained the momentum from every cavalry charge. The battlefield itself had become Edward's greatest weapon. The first men sent forward weren't the famous French knights. They were the Genoese crossbowmen, experienced mercenaries hired to weaken the English line before the cavalry attacked. Their job was simple: move forward, fire their crossbows, and create an opening for the knights behind them. But nature had already changed the battle. Heavy rain had soaked the battlefield only hours before. The English longbowmen had carefully protected their bowstrings beneath their hats and clothing. The Genoese had not. Their wet crossbows lost much of their power, and their bolts fell far short of the English position. It was exactly the moment Edward had been waiting for. He calmly gave a single command: fire. Thousands of longbow arrows filled the sky. The Genoese ranks were torn apart almost immediately. Unable to answer the storm of arrows, they began falling back in confusion. Then the French commanders made the biggest mistake of the entire battle. Furious that the Genoese were retreating, the French knights didn't stop to reorganize. They lowered their lances and charged straight through their own mercenaries, crushing men beneath charging horses and throwing the entire army into chaos before they had even reached the enemy. Edward never ordered a counterattack. He didn't need one. He simply gave another command: fire again. Wave after wave of arrows crashed into the advancing cavalry. The muddy hills slowed every horse. Fallen riders blocked the path for those behind them. The famous French charge lost all its speed before it ever reached the English line. By sunset, the battle was over. Europe's greatest cavalry had been defeated, not because they lacked courage, but because they had been outthought. At Crécy, one brilliant tactic defeated one of the strongest armies in Europe, and changed the future of warfare for the next 2 centuries. The battle was over, but its impact was only beginning. As the sun set over Crécy, the French army retreated, leaving behind thousands of fallen knights, nobles, and commanders. The battlefield was covered with broken armor, abandoned banners, and exhausted horses. What had been expected to be an easy French victory had turned into one of the greatest military disasters of the Middle Ages. Across Europe, people struggled to understand what had happened. How could the most feared cavalry on the continent be defeated so completely? The answer wasn't just the English longbow, it was the strategy behind it. Edward III had chosen the battlefield carefully, forced the French to attack on unfavourable ground, and refused to abandon his defensive position. Every decision had worked together to create the perfect trap. The battle proved something many commanders had never believed before. Discipline could defeat numbers, preparation could defeat pride, and the smartest plan could overcome even the strongest army. News of the victory spread rapidly across Europe. Kings, generals, and military advisors all wanted to understand the secret behind the English success. They expected stories of extraordinary bravery or miraculous luck. Instead, they discovered something far more important. Careful planning had defeated raw power. Before long, armies across Europe began studying the lessons of Crécy. Commanders paid greater attention to battlefield positioning, defensive tactics, and the growing importance of skilled archers. Heavy cavalry, once considered unstoppable, was no longer seen as the answer to every battle. Warfare itself was beginning to change. Crécy didn't end the 100 Years' War. The fighting would continue for decades, but it changed how future battles would be planned and fought. It marked the beginning of the decline of the armoured knight as the dominant force on the battlefield, and proved that courage alone could not overcome superior tactics. Nearly 7 centuries later, historians still return to the same battlefield to study what happened that day. Not because it was the largest battle of the Middle Ages, but because it changed military thinking forever. The Battle of Crécy became a timeless reminder that victory doesn't always belong to the biggest army. Sometimes, it belongs to the commander with the better plan.